Some people call Exodus the book of identity. Of course, we find out the identity of Moses, who is the liberator of the people of Israel. But also we find out the identity and the formation of this new nation of Israel. As Gustavo Gutierrez says, the Exodus was the foundational experience of the Jewish people. It involved a departure from a situation of slavery, exploitation, and destitution in Egypt, a foreign country, and a passage via a multifaceted process of liberation into freedom, justice, and the possession of land of their own, the promised land. But even deeper, we find out more about the character of Yahweh, the God of Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, the God who describes and discloses himself as merciful and faithful and characterized by covenantal love to the 1,000th generation. Exodus 1 picks up the story of the Hebrew people under the thumb of Pharaoh in Egypt after some 400 years since the death of Joseph. Of course, it's not surprising that the ruler of the world's superpower would be oppressing foreigners. It's not surprising that he's doing it in the most vicious way by attempting to kill the firstborn sons of the Hebrew people. What is surprising is that these two midwives, who actually get named, Shipra and Puah, they snub the king, they subvert the authority of this evil king. And what's interesting is that they get named in the story, whereas Pharaoh doesn't even get the dignity of being named. So we find out, I'll actually leave it to you to hear the echoes from the Genesis story in Exodus 2. But we find out right away, what do we know about Moses? We know that he should have died. We know that he's an adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. We know that ethnically he's a Hebrew, and culturally he's Egyptian. He's got a split identity. We know he's a murderer, and he's exiles himself because of it. He's rescuer of a damsel in distress. He meets the Pharaoh by a well. He's a foreigner living in a foreign country. He's a shepherd to his father-in-law for 40 years. He describes himself as tongue-tied. And at 80 years old, he becomes a liberator of a people. He becomes the one through whom the law of God is given to Israel. And I love the way in which Exodus describes him as a friend of God. But who's this God? God is not ashamed to associate himself again with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and remind Moses of his own deeper identity. God is not ashamed to Actually, he claims himself as the liberator. He says, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people. I have heard the cries of distress. I am aware of their suffering, and I have come down. But most interestingly, God gives his most personal name to Moses, Yahweh. I am the one who is, guaranteeing to Moses that he will be present to him. So we know who God is, we know who Moses is, but what about the Egyptians, and in particular Pharaoh? Some people worry that God dooms Pharaoh to destruction. But actually, when you pay attention to the pattern in the story, you realize that on every single time, it is Pharaoh that first hardens his heart, and only then God seals that hardening with his own action. That happens 8 times. So I think the story invites us to read it at 2 different levels. At one level, as a human agent, Pharaoh is free to make his own choices. God simply confirms afterwards the choice that Pharaoh really wanted, namely rebellion against God. But the story has a second level, because Pharaoh is not just a human agent, he is also a stand-in for the gods of Egypt. And as a divine agent, as the seat of Egyptian divinity, Pharaoh's doom is guaranteed. There's no contest here. Yahweh will absolutely win in this contest. What about the 10 plagues? Well, some people say this is just an issue of seeing a series of natural ecological disasters that result in infant mortality in Egypt. But I actually think the story wants us to see something deeper than that. Again, we see the 10 strikes of Yahweh against Egypt are a polemic against the gods of Egypt. And actually, here's a chart you can freeze frame to see how for every single one of the plagues, there's a corresponding Egyptian deity that gets attacked. And there's another interpretation of the 10 plagues, and that is the reverting to the original chaos before creation. Basically, through these strikes, through these plagues, God is undoing the creation of Genesis 1. If in Genesis 1, God gathers the waters, the gatherings of water are separated, and he orderly creates animals and vegetation, ending with the creation of mankind, the breathing clay that's made in God's image and likeness. Here in Exodus, the waters get muddled, the atmosphere, the earth is blighted, animals die, crops die, and the whole story ends with the breathless little corpses of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. As one commentator put it, at the end of the narrative in Exodus, Israel looks back over the stilled water of the sea at a land with no people, no animals, no vegetations, a land in which creation has been undone. So we see the story of Passover, God passing over the houses of the Israelites and striking down the houses of the Egyptians. We see the Sinai covenant where God pledges himself to the nation of Israel. God weds himself to Israel. We see the fundamental betrayal where Israel turns away from Yahweh in impatience and wants to follow the gods of Egypt again. And then we see God claiming them back. The covenant is renewed in Exodus 34, God revealing his deepest names to Moses as compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth. God who keeps loving kindness to the 1,000th generation, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. So what are the main themes in Exodus? Number 1, God is sovereign both over nature and over history. Number 2, God sides with the oppressed. Number 3, God intimately involves himself in Israel's history. Number 4, God is holy. He is different. He's not to be messed with. And number 5, if you belong to God, you just don't oppress others. And in fact, that theme, I think, is interwoven to the very heart of the Torah, not just in Exodus, but in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, and Numbers. In Deuteronomy 10, for instance, the very idea that God is a creator is tied essentially to the fact that God is the mighty judge of the universe who shows no partiality and who takes care of the orphan, the widow, and the foreigners. And in fact, it's so strong that God says, you must love the foreigners who live in your midst. And that's how you show that you worship this God. This theme is actually not at all accidental in the law. To love God, the Torah is tell us, is basically to show practical care for the poor, the afflicted, and the foreigner living in their midst. And it's I have actually a whole handout that I want you to read on Canvas, but it gets to the point that the entire Israel's economy has to be redesigned so that the most vulnerable groups of people, the poor, the foreigners, the orphans, the widows, are taken care of. Here's just one passage from Deuteronomy 24. When you're harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. Then the Lord will bless you in all you do. When you beat your olives from olive trees, don't go back over the boughs twice. Leave the remaining olives for the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. And the same for the grapes. What's the point? The very heart of the law, the very fact when we grasp that God is faithful, loving towards the oppressed and the outsider, we have grasped the very heart of the law. Thank you.